Here we go. So this is Algebra 1 Basic Skills. We're just going to review some of the skills that you should have learned in middle school. If you have any issues with these skills, please make sure to come see me outside of class. You can see me during lunch, or you can see me after school on Fridays for 1 hour from 3 p.m. to 4 p.m. So what I'd like you to do right now is go ahead and give these problems a try, just to make sure that we have our integer operations up to par. And if you're having issues, that's fine. That's what today is for. So go ahead and give those a try, and I'll walk around and see how you're doing. All right, so now that you've taken some time to work on these problems, let's look at solving them. So I have negative 15 plus 5. What do I get when I add those two quantities? Negative 10. How do I get negative 10? Well, I think of it this way. I owe $15 to the bank. I have $5, and I pay that back. How much do I still owe the bank? I still owe the bank $10, right? So that's $10 I don't have. So that would be negative 10. Any questions on adding positive and negative numbers? Now's the time to ask, because like I said, this is the basic skills before we start into the actual algebra. Okay, number 2 is 6 minus 7. I have a smaller quantity, a smaller number, and then from that I'm subtracting a larger quantity. What do I get? Yes. Negative 1, right. Negative 1. Let's say I have $6 and a TV costs $7. Of course, I'm still going to have to get $1. Now, I don't know of any TV that costs $7 unless you get it from a garage sale, but you get the point. All right, so number 3, I have a positive number times a negative number, and you can just say this out loud. What is that going to be? Negative 10. Just in case you forgot, I'll use a different color here. If you have a positive number times a negative number, you get a negative number. If you have a positive number times a positive number, you get, of course, a positive number. And then a negative number times a negative number, what am I going to get? A positive number. So definitely keep that in mind. It's okay. All right. All right, so I have a negative number divided by a positive number. Is that going to give me a positive number or a negative number? Negative, right. The same rules hold true for division as they do for multiplication. So when I get a negative 30 and I cut that in half, what am I going to get? Negative 15. Okay. Negative 1 times 0. Anything times 0 is? 0, right. Okay, last one. I have a positive number, and from that I'm subtracting a negative 5. What happens to the minus negative? Yeah, you add the opposite. Anytime you're subtracting a negative, you add the opposite. So I just add the opposite. So 4 plus 5 is 9. Perfect. Any questions on any of these basic integer operations? Excellent. Okay, let's go to the next one. Your first quiz is going to be a combination of these types of things. Usually students do really, really well. And the first test, students do really, really well. So hopefully you'll have a nice boost in confidence after the first quiz and test. All right. These are properties that you might not remember. So I would just, on your notes, take some time to write down the commutative, associative, identity, inverse, and distributive problems. You don't have to make a nice, pretty box like that, but you can. Oopsie. There we go. So, commutative. Let's see. Commutative, the way I remember this is when you have two numbers and you're adding them, A and B, remember, can be any real number, meaning it can be negative, it can be positive, it can be a fraction, it can be a decimal. If I have any two numbers and I add them to each other, let's say I have 3 and 4. 3 plus 4 is equal to 4 plus 3. That means I can switch them around and still get the same answer, right? So what's 3 plus 4 and 4 plus 3? 7 each time, right? So I like to think about it as the numbers like to communicate with each other. 3 communicates with 4, 4 communicates with 3. I communicate with you, you communicate with me, and I still come to the same conclusion, which is 7 in this case. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, good. The same is true for multiplication. If I have two numbers like 3 and 4 and I multiply them together, 3 times 4 is the same thing as 4 times 3. Oops, I need to unfreeze this. 3 times 4 and 4 times 3 are the same thing, and that will both get me 12. Is the same thing true for division, do you think? No, why not? Well, you're right. Let's think of an example. Is 3 divided by 4 the same thing as 4 divided by 3? Is that true? No, right? It's very different. You have a really small decimal here, and you have a number greater than 1 here. So these are not equal to each other, and that's how we write not equal to. We put a little slash through it. Do you have questions about the commutative property? It only works for addition and multiplication. And we will take a break in between notes when we have a lot of notes, so don't worry about that. Associative. The easiest way I remember associative is that the parentheses associate with different numbers. So originally you have the parentheses with the first two numbers, and then the parentheses moves over to the last two numbers. So if I was thinking of an example, and I'll do one in a different color here, if I have in parentheses 3 plus 4 plus 5, the associative property says that's the same thing as if I move those parentheses over to the 4 and 5 instead of the 3 and 4. So now I have 3 plus parentheses 4 plus 5. So those parentheses are associating with different numbers. Does that make sense? Questions on that? Same thing is true with multiplication. Those parentheses will associate with different numbers right here. Okay, identity. So identity properties means that you get the same number. So I think of my own identity. Like when I look in the mirror, I see myself. That's my identity, right? So A plus 0, that's the identity property of addition, because anytime you add 0 to a number, what do you get? You get that number, right? So what's 4 plus 0? 4. What's 3 plus 0? 3. 2 plus 0? 2, etc. So anytime you add 0 to a number, you get that number. That's called the identity property. The same thing is true for multiplication by 1. So if I multiply any number by 1, what do I get? That number, right. I get that number. So that's what makes it an identity. So identity, again, I look in the mirror, I see myself, I see my own identity. I don't know. Sometimes these, if you can think of little tricks like that to remember the rules, it makes it easier. Questions on commutative, associative, or identity properties? All right. Let's look at inverse properties. So inverse properties are different with addition and multiplication. Anytime you apply an inverse to addition, you're adding the opposite to get what number? If I have a 3 and I add its opposite, negative 3, what do I get? 0, right. So your inverse property always says, when I add a number and its opposite, I get 0. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, what's different with multiplication? We're not concerned about getting 0 with multiplication or multiplicative identity. What are we concerned about getting? One. So, what is the inverse of 4. What can I multiply 4 by to get 1? 4 times what will get me 1? 1/4, 1 over 4. 4 times 1, if I do the multiplication, I can rewrite this as 4 over 1 times 1 over 4. I multiply straight across, and I get 4 over 4, which is 1. So what's the multiplicative inverse of 1/3? Let's look at 1/3. What can I multiply 1/3 by to get 1? Any ideas? Yes. By 3 over 1. Right. When I multiply that straight across, 1 times 3 is going to get me 3. 3 times 1 is going to get me 3. What's 3 over 3? 1. Any questions? All right. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to have you try a couple, and then we'll take a break, and you can get up and stretch, check your cell phones just for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to notes, and I expect your full attention on notes. But first, before we do that, I'm going to have you practice. So, the first one, what is the first one? Commutative, right. Excellent. 2 is communicating with 4. 4 is communicating with 2. Shh, keep it down, please. So this is commutative property of addition. So let's write that down. C-O-M-M-U-T-A-T-I-V-E. Shh. Okay, number 2. What is number 2? Associative, right. Those parentheses are associating with different numbers. They associated with the 3 and 7 first, and then they associated with the 7 and 4 second. So that's associative property of multiplication. So that's associative. What about number 3? Identity, right. Anytime I add 0 to a number, I get that number. So that's my identity property.